than a mere commemoration of past history, a Jewish holiday is an event to be personally experienced and relived. If we remember actually back a few weeks ago when we learned about Purim, we mentioned the verse that is actually in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, which says, "And these days are remembered and relived," or re-experienced. And we explained that, of course, simply speaking, we're talking about Purim, and that every year on Purim we should re-experience what the Jews experienced in the story of Purim. But we also said that it applies to really all of the holidays. Every single one of the holidays has its own particular narrative on the simple level, but it also has its own particular spiritual characterization based on that narrative. So, for example, Hanukkah is the narrative of how they were able to light the menorah. Therefore, it is the festival, the Hanukkah of light. And so the concept of illuminating the darkness throughout the year, spiritually speaking, really is born out of and comes through on Hanukkah, on that particular holiday, but also for the rest of the year from Hanukkah. If we consider the Day of Atonement, again, the narrative is that we finally achieved atonement for the sin of the golden calf, but that also affords us the ability to attain atonement throughout the rest of the year for any other kinds of missteps that we might have. Every single holiday has that special something that it adds to our connection to Hashem for the year. Every Jewish holiday has a contemporary message for every Jew in every time and place. The simple reason is all of the holidays are in the Torah. Torah is eternal and infinite in that it can be and needs to be applied in any and all cases, and therefore the holidays in the same vein apply to every time and place. This is particularly true of Passover. As our sages declare, in every generation, a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally left Egypt. This is a teaching of the sages, and of course already by virtue of being a teaching of the sages, it is true, it's authoritative, it's correct. But in this particular case, this particular teaching is also a part of the Haggadah. And that really is a little bit more than just some teaching of the sages. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of verses regarding the holiday of Passover or the Exodus or something along those lines. There are tens of thousands of teachings of the sages regarding Passover or something related to it. But when we sit down on the Seder evening and we fulfill one of the two mitzvahs of the holiday, namely to retell the Exodus, we have a Haggadah which guides us through that process. In fact, the word Haggadah doesn't mean book or booklet or collection or something along those lines. Haggadah means a deep conversation or something along those lines. Lahagid means not just to say, but to say in an imbuing fashion. And so, practically speaking, the Haggadah is in fact a collection of verses and teachings from the sages that aims to achieve that purpose, to make sure that we mention all of the most important, all of the integral details of the servitude in Egypt, the exile, the eventual Exodus, so that we really and truly re-experience that event in history as we're required to do as one Passover. This declaration, this teaching that in every generation a person is obligated to regard himself as if he personally left Egypt is in the Haggadah. That means that above and beyond the fact that, again, it's authentic and authoritative because it is in fact the teaching from our sages, it is deemed to be an inherently necessary point to mention as far as re-experiencing that Exodus. The question, of course, is asked, I've never been to Egypt and I'm not a slave, so what do the sages really want from me? It cannot be that they basically want me to fake it. And on the other hand, I don't know how this would apply to me really and practically. This is the purpose of the Seder on Passover Eve, to provide every individual with an opportunity to experience an exodus from his own personal house of bondage. The opening of the Seder expresses this concept by introducing the recitation of the story of the Exodus with the declaration, Heilach Ma'anya, behold the bread of affliction. It's worthwhile to note that the words Heilach Ma'anya, even though they're not English, of course, are not Hebrew either. They are not ancient Hebrew Lashon Kodesh. They are not modern Hebrew. They are, in fact, Aramaic. And the reason why that distinction is important is because when the sages wanted to have an aspect, a component of prayer, to be understood by everyone, they composed it in Aramaic. Back in the day, the colloquial language of the Jewish people was Aramaic. Hebrew was reserved for prayer and Torah study only. And so, like now, maybe English would be a very common language for Jews to speak. Back then, it was Aramaic. And so we'll see different components of different prayers throughout the year, sometimes every day, sometimes on Shabbat, sometimes on certain holidays, in this case on the Seder evening, that are written, that were composed in Aramaic to make sure that everyone, regardless of whether they had the opportunity to have a Jewish education and therefore be able to understand ancient Hebrew, the Holy Tongue, everyone should be able to understand this particular declaration. That obviously tells us that it's incredibly important. In his Code of Jewish Law, the Alter Rebbe notes, those who are meticulous take care to say ki halachma or ha ki lachma. The additional k is in the Hebrew or Aramaic to mean like. This is like the bread of affliction, since the matzah we are eating is not the actual bread our forefathers ate. That seems logical, that seems right. If we're going to be honest, if we're going to be careful with our words, what I'm eating now might taste like it's 3,000 years old, but it's not 3,000 years old. So I should say it's like the bread of affliction, not literally the bread of affliction. In his edition of the Haggadah, however, the Alter Rebbe chooses the wording hey lach ma'anya, without the additional like. Same author, he obviously knows what he wrote in his Code of Jewish Law, and nevertheless, in his compilation of the Haggadah, he does not use the word like. He wants us to say it as if it is literally the actual bread of affliction. The only way that that's possible is that we are so keyed in and have so deeply re-experienced the Exodus on our Seder evening, even though obviously it's 2,000, 3,000, whatever years since, that we can genuinely and honestly say, this is the bread of affliction. This emphasizes that the Seder is intended to move us to the point where we ourselves experience a liberation from slavery and view the matzah before us as the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in the land of Egypt. Though we may never have been in Egypt or experienced actual slavery, redemption can be real for us, as Hasidic thought explains. Egypt is not only a geographical location, but also a state of mind. In fact, primarily, Egypt is not the geographical location. That's true for the Jewish people, the generation that lived 3,300 years ago, that they were in the GPS location known as Egypt and they left from there. But if it's that in every single generation, every single person has to consider themselves as if having left Egypt, obviously the main focus is not the geographical location. In fact, the Hebrew name for Egypt, Mitzrayim, is almost identical to the word Meitzarim, which means straits or limitations. And now we understand how absolutely and earnestly every single person, regardless of whatever generation they are in, can and should say and mean that they have left Egypt. Every single one of us has a box that we either impose on ourselves or allow for them to be imposed, but almost entirely an artificially constructed box of limitations that we think we cannot penetrate, that we cannot get out of. The entire point of Egypt, the entire point of that box, is that we should push the limit and leave it. And yes, I've never been to Egypt and I'm not a slave, but I certainly have that box, that Meitzarim, like Mitzrayim, and therefore I am supposed to transcend that box. In other words, our personal exodus from Egypt involves self-transcendence, lifting ourselves out of our natural limitations. We each possess a soul, a spark of God. And like God himself, this spark is infinite and unbounded. On the personal level, Egypt symbolizes those influences and forces which confine and limit this spiritual potential. Very similar to how the actual events occurred, that when Moses comes to the Jewish people and he says, the time of your redemption has arrived. The verse very clearly tells us that the people didn't believe him. Because of the shortness of their spirit and of the difficult labor. Outside forces that concealed the fact that the reality is your redemption has arrived. You're going to be leaving. The box that you think that you can never leave, Egypt, the superpower of the world, you can't escape, you can't be freed. That's not true. You think it's true, but the reality is absolutely not. In the same exact way, God tells us on a daily basis, in fact, as we'll see in a second, that our redemption has arrived. We can and must leave our limitations, even though every single day we might genuinely believe that that's actually not possible. The nature of this personal Egypt varies according to one's character and degree of refinement. One person's Egypt might be defined by his selfish desires and natural drives. In other words, someone whose connection to God and whose connection to his soul, which is literally a part of God, and the infinity of that soul, is so concealed and so constricted by the Meitzarim or Mitzrayim that he has around him, that he knows that God says, don't eat pork, and he doesn't anyway because he wants to. Or, put on tefillin, he doesn't anyway, he doesn't do so because he doesn't want to. Completely knowing and nevertheless violating God's will because of selfish desires and natural drives. Another's, by the bounds of intellect and reason. A little bit more refined is the person who says, look, I understand that God has given me everything that I have, anything I might ever need or want, I'm only ever going to get from God, and therefore, if he commands me certain things, I'm going to do them. I have to do them, it's only right, whether it's requirements or prohibitions. However, I don't buy this idea that God gave me things to do, requires me to do certain things, or to behave in certain ways that don't make sense. If I understand the particular commandment, whether it's a requirement or a prohibition, and it makes sense to me that I should be doing this, then I'll do it. But if not, not. Obviously, that's a little bit better than the initial standing where I'll do whatever I want just because I want to. But it's also a kind of an Egypt, a kind of a limitation, because that breaker of bound by intellect and reason is broken. That circuit breaker pops off when it's something that transcends our finite intellect. And of course, God is infinite, and therefore there can be and are plenty of commandments that don't necessarily make sense. There is even an Egypt of holiness. That seems a contradiction in terms. Egypt, holiness, but in fact, it's a state in which a person committed to spiritual growth restricts his potential for advancement, accepting his natural limitations as permanent. A person, simply speaking, who is quote-unquote observant. Everything in the Code of Jewish Law, whether it's biblical in nature or rabbinic in nature, whether it's a requirement or a prohibition, he is doing. To the best of what he knows how to do, he does. Shabbat and kosher and prayer and everything you could possibly imagine. But there are certain scenarios that he has accepted as limited, even though they might not be. And based on that erroneous axiom that I am limited in this particular way, or my situation is limited in this particular way, he chooses to opt for behaviors that really are not as right as they could be. A classic example is how much time a person invests into learning Torah. Jewish law says that if you can, you should learn Torah all day, every day. Most people cannot because they have to earn a living. And there are all sorts of gradations as to what you need, how much time you need in order to earn that living, and therefore how much time comes out of learning Torah, otherwise, all day, every day. A person who says, there's no way that I can arrange my schedule to learn more than 15 minutes a day Torah. That might be true, but that very likely is actually not true. It's just what the person imagines to be true. And so is he committed to learning Torah? Yes. But he is not committed to taking that leap of faith and saying, I'm going to push the envelope of what I think I can do, of where my limitations actually lie, in order to leave my Egypt of holiness. All of these Egypts confine our infinite godly nature. Leaving Egypt means leaping over all these and any other barriers and constraints and bringing our infinite spiritual potential to the surface. A personal experience of redemption affects the totality of our divine service. This is where Passover in particular, since we're discussing this context, is not only an experience of freedom during the actual days that are the holiday, but really plants that seed and imbues that feeling of freedom, that ability to become free throughout the rest of the year. As long as a person lives within his personal Egypt, as long as the infinite potential of his soul is denied expression, he will perceive the observance of the Torah and its commandments as external to himself, separate from the essence of his being. And that's why he can say, look, of course I have to do what the Torah says. God has given me everything I have. I have to give back whatever he asks or commands. For sure. But in that kind of a perspective, there is God and there is the person. And the person is obligated, but not because that's who he is, just because that's the scenario and that's only what's right. When a person relives the Exodus and uncovers his essential godly nature, he develops a deeper connection with the Torah. Experiencing a personal exodus from Egypt thus becomes the great foundation and strong pillar of our Torah and our faith, with relevance extending far beyond the time of the Passover celebration and applying to every moment of our lives. When the Exodus is understood this way, every dimension of Jewish conduct and every commandment a person performs becomes a step out of Egypt and an expression of his inner godly potential, an opportunity to realize his true self. To emphasize that the Exodus from Egypt is an ongoing experience, not only not ending with the particular 3,000 years ago experience of that generation of the Jewish people, but again, not ending when we are done with the actual Seder any given year, the Alter Rebbe omitted the passage beginning Chasal Siddur Pesach, which translates to the Passover Seder has been concluded, from his text of the Haggadah, even though the majority of other customs do say this line. When we've concluded the Pesach Seder, we should say we're done. The Alter Rebbe says, no, you're not done. You might be done reading through the books, reading through the Haggadah, reading through all the different verses and teachings, doing all the prayers, having the 4 cups of wine. For sure, that at some point ends. But the influence of the Seder, that inspiration that has come from the Seder, that should never end. So we don't say that particular line. Similarly, in token of the continuing relevance of the Exodus, we recall the redemption from Egypt in our daily prayers, both morning and evening. The continued significance of the Exodus from Egypt can be viewed from another perspective. The Torah says of the Jewish people, they are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. The redemption from Egypt and the subsequent experience of receiving the Torah established the identity of the Jewish people as servants of God and not servants of servants. In fact, if you remember, the laws of the Jewish servant, male servant or maid servant, is that he can be sold into servitude or sell himself into servitude if he, for example, needs to pay back some kind of a debt or if he just wants to make some money. And there are certain laws about how such a servant can be treated, must be treated. One of those is that the maximum that he really ought to be able to serve is 6 years. And after his term, at the maximum being 6 years, but whatever the term is, he is let go. He's free. The exception is that if he himself says, I don't want to go free. I like it here. My owner treats me nicely. I have a good life here for whatever the arrangement is. I want to stay. He's allowed to stay for a little bit longer, and sometimes it's actually quite a bit longer. There's still eventually a limitation, but he's allowed to stay, except that before he is allowed to stay, he is brought to the court and his ear is pierced by the doorway of the court. The sages and the commentaries ask why specifically the doorway, why specifically the piercing of the ear. It's to pierce the very same ear that heard at Sinai as a merit from the fact that we put the blood on the doorposts and therefore left Egypt. that I am the Lord your God, you shall not have any other gods before me. In other words, you are servants of mine, you should not want to be servants of servants. After leaving Egypt, they could never again be subject to the same kind of servitude. The Maharal of Prague, a very Kabbalistic kind of a perspective, explains that the freedom achieved through the Exodus transformed the essential nature of our people. Through the Exodus, we acquired the nature of free men. Despite subsequent conquests and subjugation by other nations, obviously there were subsequent exiles, whether in Babylon or Persia, the fundamental nature of the Jewish people has not changed. Our freedom is maintained only because, in a spiritual sense, God is constantly taking us out of Egypt. Not just once 3,300 years ago. The miracle of the redemption is thus not an event of the past, but a constant occurrence in our daily lives. This ongoing experience of redemption that is realized throughout our lives is intensified by reliving the Exodus during the Passover holiday. May the personal redemption experienced by every individual at that time hasten the redemption of our entire people and lead to the fulfillment of the hope expressed at the climax of the Haggadah, L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, with the coming of Mashiach speedily in our days. It's very worthwhile to note, as the note here, number 13 says, that when you say, in a couple of weeks, when we're going to be sitting down for the Seder, when you say next year in Jerusalem, the idea is not that we're waiting a year for Mashiach to come, and then in a year when he comes, we'll do the Seder in Jerusalem. Rather, that we expect Mashiach to come immediately. It's just that the next time we will be doing the Seder is in a year. And so when Mashiach comes immediately, and he's already been here for up to a year, then next year we'll happen to do the Seder in Jerusalem.